Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Bold today. My name is Michelle, and I'm the founder of Women in Climate, and I will be your host today. I remember a group of us got together in December to decide if we should do something for International Women's Day, and our conclusion was we definitely wanted to do something, and we wanted to do an event that pushes the envelope, empowers women, talks about the elephants in the room, brings together our community globally, and most importantly, helps us learn something new. And that's how Bold was born, and I can't believe it's finally taking place. Let me start by telling you a little bit about Women in Climate. Myself and our community builder, Stephanie Corbally, started Women in Climate early in 2022. We wanted to help more women get started on their climate journey by creating a joyful and safe space. We held numerous dinners and network events in New York City, and since then, we've become a bit of a force. We are a platform for women working in climate to share their thoughts and solutions. Our events feature all women speakers. We help raise awareness for our members and entrepreneurs in our community, and we've expanded to cities across the world with in-person events in the US and Europe, and more to come. Before we jump in, I wanted to say a huge thank you to our volunteers, Carter Schmidt, Melissa Dusenberry, Simran Heer, Natasha Lekwa, Stephanie Chen, and Lindsay Nunez. We have been meeting weekly since January to plan the event, and this would not have been possible without their passion and dedication. I also want to thank our media partner, We Don't Have Time. They are the largest social media for climate solutions. We have an action-packed agenda for you today with incredible speakers. You'll also be hearing some hot takes and meeting a few of our entrepreneurs. We encourage you to get social. We're on Twitter and Instagram. Be sure to tag us and use the hashtag WhackBold. Now, I'd like to hand it to my friend and fellow climate champion, Shweta Chakraborty, to kick off our first panel, What If Women Led Blank? Shweta, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for the hard work that you and your team have put in to bring this into fruition. Feels like just yesterday we were talking about this, and here we are on International Women's Day. And there's no better day or month, really, that I can think of to take stock on how far we've come as one half of the world's population. But despite that, how far we still have to go. This month really gives opportunities to groups of women and conferences like Bold, where we can actually pause and imagine what a world that finally has gender equality looks like. So what would that look like for the future of, let's say, energy, for the future of finance, for the future of companies more broadly? That's what this panel, as part of this conference, is really looking to think through and imagine. And we also are going to ask some hard questions to the panelists. And collectively, I would ask all of you tuning in from around the world to really think about this. Are we overstating how far we've come? Are we actually not thinking far enough into the future about how much further we still will need to go? What is it true that we're actually a gender and we can actually make broad statements about how we are as a gender? Are we that homogenous across our sex? So let's clear the air on whether or not women can really be grouped together as this one demographic. And there's no right or wrong answer, but each of the women that will be joining on this panel as we think through some of these tough questions will provide their perspective, their unique vantage point to reimagine their industries if women really were at the helm of it all. We're going to be more broadly discussing women's leadership traits and what makes a strong female leader. Is there still room for ego in the boardroom for women and for men? And how do we activate more female leadership? Is this even necessary? So I think we all have got responses to some of these questions, but I'm really looking forward to having this discussion and getting into some of the nitty-gritty on all of it. I will introduce myself. I am Dr. Shweta Chakraborty. I'm a behavioral scientist and I lead in media. And so I will be bringing up media and what the future of media would look like if there were more female leaders at its helm. I also have with me, and I would love for my fellow panelists to join as I do their introductions. I have with me Heather Reams. She is a leading advocate for clean energy and climate solutions in Washington, D.C. She has nearly 30 years of advocacy experience in our nation's capital and is currently leading a not-for-profit called Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. And welcome, Heather. Thank you for joining. I have with me Karen Sheffield. She is a finance executive and operator turned investor. She has over 15 years of work experience across Fortune 100 companies, and is also the founder and managing partner of Pachamama Ventures, a VC firm investing in climate tech startups. Welcome, Karen. Thrilled to have you as well on the panel. Next, I would like to introduce Layla Toplik. She is a leading expert at the intersection of technology, ethics, human rights, and SDGs. And as the head of emerging technologies at NetHope, which is a not-for-profit consortium of 65 global NGOs, she is leading initiatives focused on responsible use of technologies such as AI. And the point of this is to address climate change, human rights, education for refugees. So many applications of AI, as we know. Really excited to get into this. She was named one of the top 100 brilliant women in AI ethics in 2021 and serves on boards and committees for initiatives such as the Digital Trust Label in Switzerland. Layla, welcome. Thrilled to see you here as well. And finally, I have on our panel, Catherine Bannett, who has spent over 3 decades in financial services, including 10 years at Goldman Sachs as CEO of women-owned broker-dealer, and the last 12 years in asset management focusing on ESG and impact investing. She currently serves as a director of the publicly listed Canadian-based circular economy company, Regen3. Catherine is passionate about the intersection of financial returns and ESG factors, and she's a dedicated advocate for women. So I really could not think of a better panel to kick off Bold and to get into reimagining the future. What if women led the future of, and we'll fill in the blank from your respective vantage points. So I'm going to start off with you, Heather. We have about 30 minutes, so we have a lot to get through and not enough time. Let me start with you and ask, as a leader in energy, talk to us about the future. What does the future of energy look like, especially if it was women leading?
Well, it's such an exciting time. Thank you again for having me. This is great to be with everyone today and such a great group of women. Energy is changing. The traditional oil and gas is really slipping by the wayside, and we're seeing renewables really surge, and other kinds of technology to harness carbon and make sure that our air is clean, our water is clean. Interestingly, I'm at a conference in Houston, Texas right now. I'm taking time out to be with you all, and it was traditionally an oil and gas conference, and now there's 600 sessions this week, and over half of them are not about oil and gas. They're all about the energy transition. There's also an international crowd here as well, and a lot of those who are coming from the international business community are women. And they're talking a lot about equity, access to energy. And so I'd say with women getting involved, and we're already seeing it, is that you're really talking about access, energy, economic prosperity, but the intersection of energy and climate are inseparable now. If you're talking about energy, you are talking about climate, you're talking about the air, the quality of the air, the water, and the carbon that's being emitted. So I don't see a world any longer that we're not going to be talking about producing energy in any way without talking about climate.
I think that's absolutely fair. Thank you for setting the stage for us, and we'll get into more granularity around energy and climate. But let me move to Karen. Let's move across sectors too. Karen, what if women led venture capital? Currently, the percentage of women receiving venture capital is abysmally small. How would it change if there were more women leading investment and more women receiving that investment that were leading and launching their own companies? What would the future of business and innovation look like?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to come here. I'm super excited to be a part of this. So as we might know, in VC, there is a huge gap, right, of access to capital for women and funding as well. Women in the key role of investment partner only make up 5 to 10% globally, right? Yet when women invest, they tend to have a better average annual return for their investments than men. Several studies have shown us over the years that our portfolios, women-led portfolios, outperform men's by an average of anywhere from 0.5% to 2% annually. And investing is about independence. It's about empowerment. So it really becomes critical for half of the population to get equal access to it. More access to capital means more innovation that is really delivering the solutions that half of the population needs. So it looks like more representation. It looks like the solutions that are being built by those who need it most, right? So I think that there is a lot. And when it comes to the intersection between VC and financing and climate solutions, it becomes even more eye-opening. There are trillions and trillions of dollars annually that need to be deployed in order for us to get to net zero. So really important.
Yes, thank you. Again, thank you for setting that up. We're going to get deeper into what's going on in investing and the opportunities for women, the future for women in that space. Let's move swiftly to AI. Layla, you have such deep expertise in AI and STEM more broadly. And we know that the pursuit of STEM for women still remains a significant challenge. We need more women to pursue science, technology, math, engineering. There's so many risks and benefits that are associated with some of these technologies like AI. So what would happen if actually there were more women pursuing STEM fields and more women leading the future of AI?
Thank you, Sheta. You're absolutely right. Women are underrepresented in the STEM fields, and specific to the field that I'm focusing on, which is AI, only 20% of employees in technical roles at major machine learning companies are women. 12% of all AI researchers globally are women, and only 6% of professional software developers are women. This underrepresentation limits women's or our ability to shape the design and deployment of this powerful general purpose technology that is increasingly mainstreaming across our professional and personal lives, whether it's healthcare, finance, education, and work. And what this means is that AI is potentially being designed and deployed by a homogeneous group of people, which can perpetuate existing biases, reinforce inequalities, and overlook the needs and perspectives of underrepresented groups. So I'm looking forward to talking more about women's leadership in AI and what does it look like.
Thank you, Layla. Thank you for sharing that. So, Catherine, I'm going to turn to you. And we've been hearing about AI. We've been hearing about VC. We've been hearing about energy. And you have such experience in finance. But before I ask you what you think about finance if more women led the sector, I'm curious what traits women have that you think are unique, and why are these traits so critical for the future of the well-being on the planet? I'm going to throw a curveball and ask you that question. We'll come back to how you envision the future of finance next.
Well, it's no issue. Thank you. First of all, I think when you ask what happens if women lead, just look at what happened in pulling this conference together. I think it's an extraordinary accomplishment, and I congratulate the team, and it's a privilege to be here. When I was thinking about the traits for women, one particular leadership trait caught my eye in preparing for this panel because it resonates with me and because it's so relevant to the topics today. According to the Alternative Board, women exhibit a greater willingness to question the status quo. Strong female leaders frequently feel the need to challenge the way business has always been done. They don't necessarily accept a traditional approach to strategy and may be more willing than some male leaders in pushing back against convention when they feel strongly about finding a more effective solution. So when you think about doing nothing as the status quo position in climate change, the facts that are clear is that humans need to prioritize the well-being of the planet, to prioritize our own well-being, and finding new and more effective solutions to problems, including those being discussed today, like climate and diversity, seems pretty attractive to me. And it is something that women leaders are trained to do. By definition, it is harder to get ahead as a woman. And so pushing for change and being able to take more risks and look for the opportunities in new things is very much a part of what makes us successful.
Yeah, absolutely, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think we can say that this is an incredible group of women, and we're really pressed for time. I would love to have an hour to speak to all of you, one-on-one, but given that we just have 25 minutes or so, I'm going to turn swiftly next to Karen. I'm going to switch up the order a little bit and ask her let's get into it. Let's talk about what would the future look like if we really were able to close the pay gap between men and women? And would that be possible if we had more women actually investing in women-led companies? How do those things relate to one another? And how would this then reimagine the future of business more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk about it. So just to center ourselves on stats, right? Because I love stats and numbers. In 2020, men were still making partner at more than 5 times the rate of women in the venture capital world and investment world, right? Achieving gender equality matters in finance and VC because it allows for half of the population in the world to better be represented in fields that are directly responsible for capital allocation. Right? In 2018, the World Bank reported that globally countries lose $160 trillion, that's trillion with a T, in wealth due to these earnings gaps between women and men. So inequality in wealth accumulation and pay does have a devastating compounding effect that locks multiple generations of women in a vicious cycle. So it really becomes very important to close that gap. And when you put more women in the investment decision side of the table, you're really empowering these decision makers to actually offer avenues to give other women and other underrepresented populations access to that capital.
And that is, now we're talking about creating this equitable future. And there's potentially a massive existential crisis that's holding us back from not just the future of women, but the future of the planet, the future of all living species. And that is the climate crisis. Heather, you work right here, like you were saying, sustainability, climate, and energy. You can't talk about one thing without the other. At this point, everything needs to be really holistically approached if we're going to get ahead of this crisis that we find ourselves in. So do we have, if we actually think this through, if women actually raise their voices, feel empowered, receive the resources and the funding they need from Karen and others in her field, and are really leading the charge in their respective businesses, but contributing towards this, what we know is going to be a transition to clean energy, do we see a future that is more just and more equitable than what we have today? What do you think?
Absolutely. And I'll again point to the developing nations where, and I was just with a leader from Africa, and, over half the population doesn't even have access to energy, using wood and unhealthy ways of cooking family meals. So we're talking about leveling the playing field. In the United States, we're so fortunate to have access to so much. As compared to other nations where, the difference between having electricity or not is really important. But then goes one step further. Having electricity or not, well, that means you're using coal, you're burning something that's unhealthy, and contributing to global climate change versus getting to transitional fuels like natural gas and eventually to renewable energy is really, really important. And this is that change from talking about energy and climate and really talking about the economic prosperity. And, that means different things to different people, but we're talking about better health outcomes or better educational outcomes, particularly in the developing world. So talking about something just thinking about just leveling the playing field for the developing world. There's so many women and children out there that just don't have access to the basic needs, and they are raising their voices. As I mentioned at this international conference I'm at, it's traditionally dominated by men. There are loads of women here, and most of them are from the international community because they're coming forward and saying, we not only want access to energy, but we want clean energy. So I think these go hand in glove, but we cannot take our release our ambitions. We have to keep pushing.
Okay, I love that. So we're not just improving the gender gap, but we're also improving the more affluent nations to less affluent nations gap as well. So it's good to see progress in that direction. Of course, there's a long way to go, but there's opportunity for technologies like AI to create a more equitable future. And so let me turn to you, Layla. Talk to us a little bit about there's the many applications of AI and how the implementation of it responsibly can really create more equity across not just gender, but class and economic status and so many other things that keep various demographics from being able to reach their fullest potential. How do we actually apply these technologies responsibly and equitably?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sheta. Maybe just to briefly set the context for why we're talking about AI for climate action specifically. So what we're talking about is actually around data. Data plays a crucial role in addressing the ambiguity, the volatility, the complexity of climate change. And AI, along with other tools, can help us analyze large amounts of data, identify the patterns in data and also inform predictions, like whether a natural disaster might happen, and then design and trigger specific interventions that could prevent loss of life. I recently conducted a landscape assessment with 38 different organizations, global NGOs, and tech companies around the world to understand the role of digital in climate adaptation of vulnerable communities, some of the communities that Heather is talking about. And what we found specific to data and AI is that they're being used to predict natural disasters such as floods and droughts before they happen, and then trigger interventions, including access to water or cash resources that can prevent loss of life or displacement. AI is being also used to predict deforestation before it happens and to protect biodiversity, both of which we know, according to IPCC, are important for human survival. Another area that I'm excited about is the use of data and AI to advance sustainable practices in agriculture and industry. But something that you mentioned earlier is super important, is that equitable design and implementation of AI is crucial because the risks of AI, similar to climate change, are not equally distributed across society. We know that women and marginalized groups are often the ones that are most negatively impacted by AI. There are a number of examples, women being denied job opportunities by AI-based systems, or receiving incorrect medical diagnosis, or being misidentified by facial analysis software. So there are a number of things that we need to do in order to ensure equitable design and implementation of AI. And I'll just mention three very briefly, and happy to go into detail later. First, we need to ensure that AI development and deployment is guided by diverse teams that are representative of our society, including women. As mentioned earlier, women do bring diverse and different perspectives. They have different lived experiences. They also have a different set of skills that they could bring to AI development. Secondly, I talked about data earlier. Well, data is key to AI. So it's key also to equitable and inclusive design of AI. And we need to make sure that data used to train AI systems is representative of diverse populations. I'll just mention one data point so you understand why data is so critical, is that 37% of the world today, about 2.9 billion people, have still never used the internet, and many more are actually having a very limited access to the internet. What this means is that their experiences, their needs, their perspectives are not going to be visible to us if we were to use the data from the internet to train AI systems like ChatGPT. So I cannot stress enough that ensuring that AI reflects the diversity of the people it intends to serve is essential for building that fair and just society that we're talking about. And just the last point that I want to mention in terms of equitable implementation of AI is that we must ensure that AI solutions are actually accessible and affordable for everyone, regardless of their gender or socioeconomic status. Similar to Heather, just to bring up an example from Africa, women in sub-Saharan Africa are 30% less likely to own a smartphone than men in the region. So if we're designing climate smart agricultural apps to help them predict weather or to determine what seeds to plant, we have to ensure that they have the equipment, the resources, the finances to take the full advantage of such solutions.
Thank you for that. And look, here we are just at the tip of the iceberg talking about AI. We could definitely do an entire session on it. And we're talking about energy. Of course, we can do an entire conference on all of these different topics, finance, VCs, but there's so many common themes that are coming out as you're all speaking. And they're really complementary to one another as we reimagine this future and we think through what it's going to look like if we truly have equal representation, if there really are fair distribution of resources, if there's access to technology, equitable access to technology, and if those lived experiences become part of the solution as well for everyday women and then those who are in positions of decision-making power. So with that, let's get to finance now, Catherine. We haven't reimagined truly the future of finance yet. As an executive from finance, what did you experience, first of all, being a woman in the sector, an underrepresented sector for women? And what would it look like? What would finance look like if we saw more women really leading the charge?
What was it like for me? Challenging. I used to talk about being a pioneer, that I didn't realize that I actually was paving new ground for the world, and didn't realize that, didn't recognize that as a pioneer, I had to keep in mind that you often get arrows in your back as you're moving west, young man. And I think there's been a lot of change and big progress, but we still have a very long way to go, in my humble opinion and in my experience and what I've seen. I actually hope AI will help us. As Karen highlighted, there's 3 decades of data showing that female money managers outperform their male counterparts, and yet they manage less than 3% of the money. VC funding to women is about 1.6%. And as Karen said, about 5% of the money goes, 5% of the employees are women. But in addition, Fortune magazine talks about 8.8% of CEOs are women, up from 2 in 2000. I suppose that's progress, as you said, Sheta, but we have still a long way to go. So I think that the data is there to support change, but the data isn't being incorporated into the decision-making. And my hope is that the future of finance includes people losing their preconceived notions that ignore the data about climate as well as about diversity, and that models allow us to actually incorporate those important facts and the statistics into our own decision making. And the risk, of course, is that the algorithms often have built-in bias. And so we also need a lot of gender equitable women building the code who don't incorporate those biases into the analysis. And I think then women do have a chance to lead, and that they bring a great deal of terrific talent that will then be able to be incorporated. We should acknowledge that we do have the first CEO of a bank in the United States at Citibank, and that happened.
Yes, we do.
So hats off to her, and we thank her for her leadership.
Fantastic. Thank you. So let's bring up one more theme that really unites us all, which is, I mean, this is put on by Women in Climate. We're talking about climate, one of the biggest threats to our future. And all of your perspectives are ultimately looking towards creating a more equitable future for women, but none of that matters if we don't have an environment that we can actually function in, that we can operate in, that we can raise our families in. And so how is all of this that we've been talking about really going to help overcome this climate crisis? I'm curious, I'll start with Karen here, but what is it that having women in leadership really means for overcoming the climate crisis? And why is that such a priority and a focus, especially for you, somebody in your position?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about that. I think I only came recently with the stat and some reading in my research that 80% of people displaced by climate change in the world are women. Women are also more vulnerable to the aftermath of climate disaster. They face higher rates of sexual and health violence and health problems after floods, monsoons, and landslides all around the world. And women are actually, during the pandemic, it was proven that we are better leaders in times of crisis. A study comprised of 194 countries found that the pandemic responses were systematically better in countries led by women. So climate leadership needs female representation to ensure a truly just transition, and that matters because, especially in the world of financing the transition, it's one of those things that you can't just leave out of the table, especially when you're talking in the VC world about making investment deals and investing in climate solutions. I think most investors don't pay enough attention to the risk management part of the equation, right? It's, yes, we are chasing returns, but yes, we are also trying to mitigate risks. And I think that has a lot to do with ensuring the just transition, ensuring that you don't really run into operational and reputational risks later down the road. When you think about investing in a climate tech solution or a business, you should definitely consider that all stakeholders involved in the decision making, whether that's your local governments, whether there's communities, who is impacted ultimately by the solution. So it's an important consideration.
Yeah, thank you for that, Karen. And, Leila, you're getting a lot of support here for AI. And a lot of these technologies are considered dual use, that there can be really positive outcomes. Equally, there can be nefarious applications of any technology, but AI hears a lot about that. But if we had more women involved and more women that were really thinking through the applications of AI, how would it be used truly for its ultimate benefit? How can it be applied in a way that really closes that gender gap, but then also is supporting overcoming this climate crisis?
Yeah, such an important question, and just also building on the example that Karen mentioned around 4 in 5 displaced are actually women. So starting with that, even just being able to understand what problems we need to solve and for whom, and recognize that women specifically have different concerns, maybe related to safety of themselves and their families, access to food, access to healthcare. So if we bring that into first the determining what solutions we build, if then collect data that is representative of the population that we're serving, and then ensure that the solution is truly reaching them and benefiting them in a sustainable way, we can create, again, a more responsible, equitable, and beneficial use for AI. Another thing that I definitely want to emphasize is that if women led AI, I believe that they would use AI to address social challenges such as climate change, ensuring that AI is used for a greater good. So we definitely need to be looking at these opportunities and also intersectionalities, as Catherine mentioned, around finance and AI and climate. How do we address some of these structural inequities while also designing the solutions that are specifically tackling the challenges of climate change? So I'll pause here.
Leila, I love that. Since you just teed up Catherine, and Catherine definitely has opinions on AI and data and how AI could help bring data to the surface to create this more equitable gender future, I'd love to actually pass the baton to her and get her reflections on this as well. Please, Catherine.
I guess it's stunning to me that women are not more included. It's stunning to me that we are not more aggressive about trying to solve the problems of climate change. And I do think I'm going to go back to the AI solution. I think we as humans have a lot of unconscious bias, and we change our behavior very slowly. And the more tools we have to drive change, the more tools we have to embrace change. And in fact, the more we have women in leadership who are more open-minded to change in general, partially because they needed to embrace change in order to get where they are in leadership positions in the first place. I think that's where our hope is. And the concept that we're comfortable and therefore we don't need to do anything is something that women have not been able to live with ever in the history as a large group, in my understanding of the arc of history for women. And so I'm very optimistic that things like this conference and our gatherings here will help people think differently and be more open to embrace all the things that can happen. We are short on time, so hopefully what happens in the next 30 years will be better than what I saw happen in the last 30 years.
We're short on time for this panel because I want to keep talking to each of you. We're short on time to overcome the climate crisis. The name of my company is We Don't Have Time. So I think that's another major theme that we will pull out from this discussion that we can follow up on in future discussions. And that's what this is. I have never been more proud to share the stage with a fantastic group of women. And one of the big questions I asked in the beginning of this was, are we homogenous? Can we actually say that? No, of course not. But there is something that really ties us together. And I think, Catherine, you just so eloquently put it forward. There really is something to be said for us as a demographic, as the gender that is women, in terms of what we could do to usher in a future that is brighter, it's more equal, it's more breathable. We don't have to worry about how long our children are playing outside on the playground because of how hot the temperature is and how unhealthy that is for their health potentially. That's something that we intrinsically as women look towards and care about. So I agree with you. And I think you just helped address one of those big questions that was posed at the beginning of this panel. And we're not done yet. And I want to come to each of you for your call to action to those who are tuning in. But before we do that, I want to go to Heather to pose another big question. We've started with big questions. We've gotten into the details. And now we're ending with this next big question, which is, are we going to get there, Heather? Are we going to be able to really responsibly transition to clean energy? And what will the role of women be in that transition?
So 100% yes. Okay, it's going to happen. One, because women are leading the charge in so many ways. Fear not, like I said, but continue the ambition. The technology that is happening right now is incredible. And I'm always heartened as I travel around throughout the year and see the amazing technologies that we didn't even know that were going to exist. Right. And much less, you think about the last 10 years, how your life has changed because of technology. This is also going on in energy. Like I said, this intersection of energy and climate is inseparable now. And it wasn't that way before. Let's have energy, let's turn our lights on, who cares? There's plenty of time. And I think most people now know that the climate is changing, that energy and humans with energy are contributing to that. And people want to know what they can do themselves. They want to know their carbon footprint. And so they can take action there individually. And women doing this, I think, is also so important. We just bring a different perspective. I know we've been talking about this on this panel. We have a different perspective, but we build consensus as well. We bring people along in a way I don't think that I've seen with my male counterparts. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm surrounded by men trying to influence decisions all the time. And I feel like women just have this more pragmatic approach about what makes sense, what's good, what's healthy for our families and our communities. But long story short, I am incredibly optimistic, but I encourage people to keep pushing.
All right. Well, thank you. I love that positivity. And I think that's a unique feature that we all share as well, that we can actually overcome this climate crisis. Me as a woman in media, I see what women who are coming up with the storylines, developing the content, those who are producers, early in their career, all the way to executive producing various segments and documentaries and films, what the stories are like when they are at the helm of making these decisions. And they're much more relatable. They're much more realistic in terms of day-to-day experiences that women and families and communities have in the United States and around the world. And so because of more leadership of women behind the scenes in media, we're seeing a lot more media that is reaching the masses and telling stories that are more positive and that are more solution oriented. And that's very much how I lead my business as well. So I think I agree very much. And I echo and underscore all of the positivity and all of the solution oriented data that you've all shared with us and your hopes for the future. And I would love to leave our audience tuning in from around the world, thanks to We Don't Have Time and the amplification of this conference. I know we have hundreds of thousands watching us right now, no pressure, ladies, but if you had, a call to action, one thing to kind of have the audience take away, to inspire them, to motivate them, let's leave them with that. Let's get the global audience excited for the rest of this conference and for what they can do in their day-to-day. from everything that they've heard from us. So let's start with Layla, please.
All right, so for everyone, encourage more women to enter STEM and to stay in tech field. Related to that, fund the development of AI solutions for climate action that incorporate diverse perspectives, that prioritize gender equity that we've been talking about here, that also address the issues of inequity at every stage.
Thank you. Very concise and to the point. I love that. Heather, over to you.
Well, I am in the nonprofit sector, and as hard as it can be some days, but I love my work. I love being passionate about what I do every single day. So my call to action is to encourage people to love what they do, find out what you're passionate about, and you'll never work a day the rest of your life.
I love that. That couldn't be more accurate. It's true. And in DC, we're uniquely we uniquely blur the lines between what your hobby is and what your work is. So I can completely appreciate that sentiment. Karen, over to you.
Yeah, I would say to all the women around the world that are building, scaling, and funding climate solutions, we need you, right? We need you. We need you to plug into the community. You can't do this alone. The climate crisis takes a village to fight it. So I would say join organizations such as Women in Climate, right? One of the organizations that we are partnering here today for the event, and join the efforts, really join together so that we can get to parity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. Catherine, final word is yours.
Responsibility. Find your power. We are 51% of the population. We control 70 to 80% of the purchasing decisions and 40% of the global wealth. That's power. And every time we buy something, vote, or invest our funds, we can do it with an eye to what really matters to us. And I highlight climate and diversity as two very powerful places to vote with your dollars and join the movement of seeing that we do have a lot of power, and it's time to exercising it for the things we care about the most.
We are the household's decision makers. We have power in our decision making. That's every woman. We can join, we can start businesses, we can collect the resources we deserve, we can allocate resources to those who are doing great work. Thank you for sharing that, Karen. Thank you for your comments, Heather, Layla. I would just like to emphasize that women are incredibly intrinsically qualified and are just beginning to realize the fullest of their potential as a global collective, and what that means for overcoming the climate crisis and so many other crises that we collectively face. Gives me a lot of hope that we are going to get there. So we're really just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of unleashing the power of women and girls and seeing that what we can do. So get excited, get inspired. We're going to solve these issues that we're facing, and we're going to actually usher in a future that is better than anything we've ever created in the past. Imagine one that's truly equal, one that's truly breathable, one that's, clean. All of these things is exciting to look forward to. So keep that in mind when you're facing your eco-anxiety, which I know we all deal with, and pass it on to the next generation of women and girls too. This is just the beginning. So thank you very much to my esteemed panelists for your contributions and the work that you do, have done, continue to do, and will do in the future. And with that, we are concluding What If Women Led. Back to Michelle and to the Bold Conference. Thank you so much, Michelle. Over to you.
Wow. Just wow. I feel so empowered after that conversation. Thank you to our panelists, each and every one of you. We have been so busy on Twitter with lots of tweets coming at us. And as Shetta said, let's go build a future that is better than the past. Now, we would not be pushing the envelope if we didn't include some hot takes. And over the past month, we've invited our community and friends to share what's on their mind. So let's have a look.
My name is Jojo, and my hot take is about ecocide law. It's a protective law that many governments are talking about, a law that draws a moral and legal red line to prevent the most severe, indeed criminal, harms to our planet, ecocide. It's a law that levels the playing field for doing the right thing. Already being described as a key driver of change, ecocide law will create a welcome steer at the highest levels of government and industry, exactly where it's most useful. It's approaching, so watch this space.
Hi, I'm Anusha Sethuraman, and this is my hot take for Bold. Climate education should be an absolute necessity right from elementary school as a separate initiative. We need to ensure that the kids who have to deal with the problems that we have created know and understand climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, the problems, the solutions, and are better prepared and equipped to not only face the realities, but also come up with innovative solutions right from a young age. So let's prioritize climate education.
Woo! Coming in hot. Thank you, Jojo and Anusha, for speaking up and raising the volume and temperature on these important topics. You can catch more hot takes on our website. On to our next topic, population. And this is one that weighs on my mind. I've been to many conferences, but have yet to attend a session that includes this elephant in the room on the agenda, until now, that is. Population is a key topic, and this conversation is an incredible learning opportunity. I'm very excited to invite Melissa Ginroli with Warrior Love Productions and Nandita Bajaj from Population Balance to the stage. Melissa, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you for the beautiful Women in Climate community that you've been doing and for putting together this event. It's great to be among so many women who are bold in speaking about these topics. And with that, I'll introduce Nandita Bajaj. She is the executive producer of a population control podcast, and she is an expert in all things around population control as they relate to gender equality and climate justice. So Nandita, it kind of seems like it would make sense that population control has a direct effect on climate change, the climate crisis, and how people adapt to climate and policy. Yet it doesn't seem to be a main theme when we're at big global conferences, whether that's COP27 or UN events of the World Economic Forum. I was at both of those conferences the last couple of months, and it wasn't a huge theme, at least not this past year. Why is it important to bring these two topics together to talk about their intersection and for people to understand the implications?
Thank you, Melissa, and thanks to Women in Climate for having me here. Of course, population is a topic that many organizations, as both of you have noted, as well as environmental leaders shy away from, and that's at our own peril. And I'm grateful to Women in Climate for inviting a bold dialogue on this very critical issue. To answer your question, Melissa, one thing is we don't use the term population control because control in the past has led to a lot of, dark history in terms of violations of reproductive rights. But to answer your question, why population is such an important topic, I'd have to just go back a little bit in terms of deep time history. Population growth started to become a real issue in our recent history, mainly over the last 200 years, due to fossil fueled industrialization and advances in medicine, such that more people were surviving. So while it took us 200,000 years to reach our first billion people, it took us only 200 years to grow from 1 billion to 8 billion, a rate of growth that ecologists and scientists call an aberration in our Homo sapien history. There's nothing normal about the way in which we have colonized our planet and decimated most other life on Earth. It's never happened before as a result of human-driven activity, and that's why we also call this epoch the Anthropocene. So in terms of what the real issue is, according to the Global Footprint Network, we're currently demanding 75% more from Earth that it can support sustainably. And that demand is a product of both our growing numbers and our skyrocketing consumption, which has led us into the state of what ecologists call ecological overshoot. And ecological overshoot includes As some of the earlier panelists talked about, both ecosystem loss and biodiversity collapse, but also climate change. And climate change with organizations, amazing organizations like yours, has finally started to penetrate public awareness. And because its effects directly threaten both humanity and civilization, but also we have to remember that ongoing mass extinction may ultimately be the greater existential threat for us. Without a healthy and intact web of life, humanity cannot hope to survive and thrive. In terms of climate change and its direct relationship to population, which is today's talk, over the last 200 years, as our population has grown by a factor of 8, our consumption has increased by a factor of 100. But that growth, again, that has been mentioned before, has been unequally distributed, both in population and in consumption. And that's what makes this a really complex issue. Our carbon emissions are a great proxy for our consumption. And there are 2 parameters to determine our collective carbon emissions, both the number of people and also the quantity emitted per person. And when we look at this aggregated in terms of income, we actually see the disproportionate impact that the richest half of the world has had on climate change. So the richest half of the countries emit 86% of the global carbon emissions, the bottom half only 14%. So you can see that climate change is inextricably linked to economic inequality, a crisis that's driven by the greenhouse gas emissions of the haves that has hit the have-nots the hardest. But when we look at the emissions contributions by region, we see the other half of the picture. Asia, for example, which is home to 60% of the population, emits 50% of the global emissions. So the focus on the rich can give the impression that it's only the emissions of the extremely rich that are the problem. What isn't made clear enough in the public debate is that for the world's energy supply to be sustainable, the greenhouse gas emissions of the majority of the world population are currently too high everywhere. The problem, is larger for the extremely rich, but it isn't limited to them. And Asia, including China and India, where I'm from, are 2 of the largest growing economies, is where a lot of the next, within the next decade, the majority of the emissions are also going to come from. So it's a matter of not either or, but rather both, as is confirmed by the latest report from the IPCC that says both population and consumption have driven these issues. So, to conclude the first question, from a human rights perspective as well, continued population growth means adding more and more people to places that are most vulnerable to climate change. And so denying the role of population in communities where women and children are already the most disempowered group is inexcusable. And so really we have to, in order to afford a good standard of living for all, as Heather said earlier, in order to really level the playing field, we have to look at both our numbers, scaling back both our numbers and our consumption.
Yeah, when it comes to consumption, well, actually, let me rewind a little bit there. When it comes to the way governments address population control, you and I had a conversation a week ago. Not everybody was privy to this, obviously, but I remember you talking about the way different countries have been addressing population control. And you said they lacked imagination. There was no imagination or creativity put into what they've been doing to try to address it, particularly in some of the biggest countries in the world. Why do you think that is? And why do you think it seems to be somewhat of a taboo topic when it comes to policy and the ways that the government or the private sector are looking at the situation?
Yeah, thank you. This is such an important question. And I think this is also at the heart of why so many reputable environmental conservation and reproductive rights organizations completely dismiss, ignore, or fully deny the role that population plays in worsening all of our crises. And there are a few reasons, one of which you just mentioned in terms of this denial. And it's the dark history of bad population campaigns and policies. Since we became aware of the impact of population growth, many incredible family planning strategies were put into place, and so many of them elevated the status of women and girls by affording them control over their own fertility. And they also led to social and economic empowerment for countries that did it well, like you said, who actually used good imagination. These were countries like Thailand, Iran, Costa Rica, Bangladesh, Morocco, and many, many more, which managed to see drastic improvements in both population decline and women's empowerment. However, there were some more draconian policies that truly relied on violating reproductive rights and human rights. Like China's one-child policy, like the forced sterilization programs in Puerto Rico and India and a few others that used coercive means to control the population. And not only were they gross violations of reproductive rights, they actually tainted the entire population movement with the fear that coercion might be used. And, to top that off, the history of the eugenics movement driven by white supremacy in both the US and Europe, which predated these population efforts, but definitely influenced them. It further muddied the water, and people became convinced that reproductive coercion was the only way to address population-related issues. In fact, when it comes to reproductive control, a lot of people don't realize that coercive pressures to bear children are far more prevalent and pervasive than pressures to restrict births. And that's my area of research and study. Most of us have been socialized to believe that the act of having children is an inevitability, it's a universal norm, and the assumption that it always happens under positive circumstances. So while all forms of reproductive coercion are egregious and must be denounced, what's happened over the last few decades since we've silenced the discourse on population is that over-focusing on one has actually prevented us from seeing the other. And, part of the climate crisis and a lot of the other crises is our growth-based systems. Patriarchal, religious authorities, capitalist elites all rely on perpetual growth to grow their institutions. And so they engage in a variety of reproductive coercive methods to ensure a constant supply of followers, consumers, cheap laborers. And so a lot is gained from large populations remaining disempowered so that, capitalism can continue to engage in modern day slavery by subjugating people in countries where human rights and environmental regulations are minimal or do not exist.
Yeah, that is a lot to process and digest. I mean, it's really just the corrosive population strategies for control is also simply just another way for the systems to control women's bodies, right?
Exactly.
We only have a few more minutes, but you touched on something that I want to make sure we get into a little bit of education on, because I think it's important. You mentioned some key areas, parts of the world. Where are you seeing the worst strategies to population control? But more importantly, where are you seeing solutions that are really working that you think could be replicated in other parts of the world?
Yeah. So some of the countries that I mentioned that have created amazing models for us to replicate are countries like Thailand, Iran in the past. Iran's unfortunately flipped. What has happened in the past is there were so many incredible family planning campaigns that actually gave girls and women control over their bodies, that allowed them to continue education through high school and university, that allows people to pursue other opportunities so that they are empowered. In so many countries, these campaigns work so well that the fertility started to decline, because that's what happens when women have control over their bodies. They tend to have fewer or no children, as you can see in industrialized countries where reproductive autonomy is its highest, fertility rates are low. And so, unfortunately, what's starting to happen now is a lot of these countries are starting to reverse some of their campaigns because it worked so well, and the women are too empowered. But I don't want to fall into that hole right now.
That's another conference, right?
100%.
That's another panel that could be a whole other conference. Well, thank you so much, Nandita. I didn't actually introduce you properly. I wanted to say the full name of your podcast, Population Balance, and that you're an adjunct professor at Antioch University. Where can people find out more about your production and your work?
Well, I'm the executive director of Population Balance. So that's a nonprofit organization that challenges pronatalism, which is another thing I didn't talk about that much. I run the Overpopulation podcast, and I also run the first of its kind graduate course on pronatalism, overpopulation, and the planet that people can learn more about.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm hoping that there are a lot of women and men, that there's a good balance. As the name of your organization is Population Balance, I'm hoping that there's a good balance across genders that are seeking information and working with you. With that, we're going to wrap up and we'll go to the next panel.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wow, that was a bold conversation. And I'm so proud that our community is igniting discourse on the topic of population. Thank you, Melissa, for helping us tease out so many important nuggets. And thank you, Nandita, for the work that you do and for sharing your time with Bold today. What was your favorite takeaway from this conversation? Be sure to tell us on Twitter or social media. Next up, highlighting women entrepreneurs has always been a priority at Women in Climate, and it's no different at Bold. We invited entrepreneurs to showcase their solutions. You can check out a few here.
Hi, I'm Ines, the founder of Wild. Wild is developing radically sustainable, ocean-friendly and healthy period products from seaweed. Seaweed is one of the most sustainable ways ever to produce biomass. It is a zero-input crop, requires no fertilizers, no pesticides, no fresh water, and not even land. And it also grows up to 10 times faster than land plants. Currently, there's hardly any way to menstruate healthily and sustainably. With our Calpong, we reinvent tampons and offer a non-harming solution for everyone. The menstruators, the oceans, and the environment.
I'm Christine Carlson, coming to you from Maplewood, New Jersey. Did you know that 80% of wedding dresses sold in the US come from China? Their cheap synthetic materials are highly planet polluting. I started Maybell to reimagine vintage dresses and to sustainably transform brides so that they can bring the magic of the past present.
Thank you, Ines and Christine, for creating solutions to help us be more sustainable. Catch more entrepreneurs on our website. Our next topic is degrowth. Exploring alternative economic models is a huge area of learning opportunity. I'm so happy to have Terry Slavin from Routers and Dr. Helen Kopnina from Northumbria University to bring this topic to life. Over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Michelle. There's a growing realization that we humans are destroying the world's ecological foundations through our overconsumption of resources and pollution. There are so many alarming statistics. Over 1 million species are at risk of extinction. A third of the world's topsoil has been degraded. Half of the coral reefs have been destroyed. And with more than more than half the world's economy dependent on nature and its services, this loss of biodiversity is undermining our economy, our development, our health, and our social stability. And on top of it all, we continue to increase the amount of greenhouse gases we pump into the atmosphere every year, despite the warnings that we must cut emissions by some 45% by 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And it's also deeply unjust, as we've heard earlier, the impacts of climate change being felt by those most acutely in the global south, billions of people who've done the least to contribute to overheating the planet. And there's also the injustice to the billions of members of other species whose habitats are being degraded or converted into so-called productive land. This has led some to question whether growth in GDP, which has driven economies for the past century, should be replaced by a metric that puts human and ecological welfare above economic expansion. And that's the degrowth agenda. And that's what Dr. Helen Kopnina and I are discussing today. Helen, let's start by telling me what you do and how you became interested in this topic.
Well, my background is, as a matter of fact, in anthropology, so a study of different cultures. Slowly but surely, I grew into what you might call a sustainability specialist. I'm working for a business school for over 20 years now, starting in the Netherlands and now here in England. One of the most interesting topics these days we notice at the schools is so-called idea of circular economy, how consumption of natural resources can occur independent of, let's say, virgin materials, such as, well, what extractive industries are trying to get out of the ground, either through logging, mining, fishing, or other activities. And the idea of degrowth is indeed partially to decouple economic activity from resource consumption.
So is it possible? Can we do this? And how?
It's going to be easier for some things than for others. Some of the things that we're using right now through the medium of computers, telephones, technology. And in the earlier panel, we heard a lot about artificial intelligence, for example, and technological advances in, let's say, renewable energy. These are all the good things, and indeed, it's quite possible to, let's say, reuse the parts of electronic equipment, for example, from computers, telephones, etc., to make new ones, basically refurbish things, recycle, or even better, because recycling is a form of downcycling sometimes, to basically reuse them, and sometimes infinitely. Precious metals, such as iridium or silver or gold, obviously they're not precious for nothing. We do want to reuse them. When it comes to material goods, such as food, for example, or clothes, that becomes more difficult due to the laws of thermodynamics. Once we've consumed something such as food, what comes out of it is not exactly reusable in the same way. It's less in quality. But we can still do things with it. For example, we can use it for fertilization of the fields or for fermentation process that would actually produce thermal energy. So yeah, there are solutions, but as long as, going back to the previous panel, there are 8 billion of us, and we're all consuming things, whether we're male or female, it doesn't matter in this regard. Yeah, we still might have a bit of a challenge.
So yeah, I guess policymakers have to be really promoting this. It was reported last month by a group of economists, including former chief economists to the World Bank. They'd written a letter to the Chinese government asking it to adopt a new development model based on well-being rather than GDP growth in its next 5-year plan. Is this something that, China or any other country is really embracing?
Yeah, I think there is also a bit of it's not just with China, it's also with America and with all of us. We do have this positivity bias. And I think thinking positive is a wonderful thing, but we, in a sense, should not be just stuck with thinking positively. We should also think critically, and we should think what is really possible. One of the things about GDP and things like economic growth that are normally seen as a good thing, and they're seen as a good thing in politics, in media, in conversations. Also, university students learn that it's a good thing. But I think if we really question how this economic growth relates to things like increased consumption of natural resources, then this critical thinking is important for instructing us. And I think it's indeed not just China that has an issue of how to address it, but perhaps all of us, and perhaps platforms such as this one, and increasingly a number of conferences and talks and university level courses, as well as school courses, addressing the so-called post-growth alternatives, because there are alternatives and they will address quality of life for sure. They are emerging and they're very hopeful indeed.
I mean, as a small thing, the idea of a 4-day week, just emphasis on people having greater life satisfaction rather than making more money. The largest trial in the UK, more than 3,000 workers from 61 companies who worked 80% of their hours, and they had no loss of pay. Actually, they were more productive, and the company's revenue stayed the same. So actually, you can have more of a focus on well-being rather than just on income, maybe.
Yeah, well, that's definitely one aspect of it, that the idea of we always want more work, more income, more everything. And sometimes we also realize that having a bit less and enjoying it more is actually the greatest value. And as we women know, sometimes value lies in something quite different. It can be our families, it can be our relationships, it can be enjoyment of being out in nature, going for a walk in the park, etc. These things have a humongous value. It's not necessarily an economic or consumptive value, but they are the things that make us as human beings, perhaps not just women, happier than just having more.
Do you think there's been a lot of talk about biodiversity now as nature and climate solutions having to be addressed together, because the two crises are very much interlinked, and it's actually more something that's been only dawning on people quite recently? Do you see, and we've seen the treaty on the oceans, on the high seas and the oceans, we saw this COP15 treaty. Do you think that this is going to make GDP, this idea of economic expansion, this appreciation that actually, and especially as we move to a clean economy, that's going to result in a lot of more extraction of resources in order to be able to have electric vehicles, and we have to get the energy from the land now rather than where it has been extracted, which has been through the, fossil fuel extraction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think one of the crucial terms here, concepts, is so-called dematerialization, otherwise known as product to service shift. So sometimes we think about the objects that we buy and they're made not to last. It's also called built-in obsolescence. And the idea is that we as consumers will run and buy many more of them. And there's also, as you've mentioned, electric cars, for example, the idea that every time there's a better product on the market, so we should buy it. This causes a rebound effect because you need also a lot of new materials for making a new car. Also, you need cobalt, for example. A lot of electricity for electric cars still comes from fossil fuel, by the way, and these cars still use parking space and roads, etc., etc. So the idea instead is to share a lot of things, a sharing economy, or collaborative economy, in which you have the use of high quality products that do not break and that we lease from a company. Let's say we lease a washing machine, which the company itself will be responsible for repairing or refurbishing. And actually it will be of a better quality because it's not in the company's interest to have it thrown out. The service that they would provide would be indeed to maintain it, keep it in use, while we will not require constantly new washing machines. Same for cars. So an idea of a shared car, for example, electric or not electric, is much more important than having individual cars for each family member. I'm now in England, of course, but I do have an American passport. And whenever I visit my family in the United States, I'm surprised how each and every family member has a large SUV. And, it's pretty much incredible how little of sharing is actually happening. And indeed, it is an idea to get a new model of whatever. And whenever the child grows up, actually from the moment the child is born, just the number of commercially produced diapers and toys given for first birthdays already and stuff basically accumulated, that's incredible. While in some more traditional societies and indigenous communities, you play with one toy that you make out of, let's say, something you find in the forest, and you have great joy with that just because you don't have this infinite amount of things to get and want to have more. Again, it goes back to wanting less and enjoying more of what you have.
That sounds very optimistic, and that's clearly what we should be striving for. And I guess it's going to require companies to come up with radically new business models, and for regulators to start to try and nudge companies and consumers into that direction. Do you think this has to be driven by consumers or by the companies themselves? And choice editing, for example.
Both, actually, 3 players, I would say: consumers, companies, and the governments. It's not very popular in neoliberal economies for governments to control anything, because the idea is that we as consumers should have a free choice. There's this wonderful American anthropologist called Cindy Eisenhower, and she has written a number of articles on Swedish consumerism, and actually said that it does make perfect sense for the government and also for corporate elites to say that responsibility is with us consumers, because then it means that they don't have to control any kind of socially damaging or environmentally damaging practices. It's going to be good for re-elections, and for companies it's going to be good for profit. But unfortunately, indeed, when you don't have any control over what's being produced, so you have those limitless choices, which includes a choice of something which is unethical, unsustainable, constantly produced in huge quantities, hurting, let's say, anything from social and inequality and justice related issues, for example, with child labor, etc., to obviously environmental systems. And you've mentioned biodiversity, and that would be the very first victim to fall to our overproduction, overconsumption, and overpopulation.
Well, we are seeing, particularly in Europe, you're seeing quite a bit of legislation to try to promote the circular economy. You're seeing also in terms of trying to prevent deforestation in supply chains. So, and I think in the US as well, this is emerging. So I think there is some hope that this can happen.
Definitely, there is some hope that it can happen. At the beginning of this discussion, somebody said that we women, we can also vote with our portmonnaies because of the buying power, among other things. Well, I think sometimes it's also good not to use our buying power. And sometimes it's also good to consume less. And consume differently. Indeed, we cannot consume less food because we need it for survival, obviously, but we can think what type of food we're eating. So one of the arguments is to transition towards more vegetarian diets. And this could be anything from lab-grown meats to, let's say, vegetarian substitutes, for example, because cattle farming hurts both biodiversity through expanding areas needed for growing animal feed and taking away wild habitats, to things like climate change, because cattle emits enormous amounts of methane, one of the top 2 greenhouse gases. And also eating in such a way that it's more locally produced, for example, that makes a huge difference in terms of transportation that's used for food chains.
Helen, thank you so much. That's food for thought. We could talk on for hours, but I think that's been the case with all the panels today. Thank you so much. It was really great to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Wow, that was definitely some food for thought. Thank you, Terry and Helen, for a very thoughtful conversation. And a focus on happiness and well-being would be very much welcomed. And as always, we're looking forward to hearing your key takeaways on social media. Tag us and use the hashtag #WhackBold. Well, I can't believe that brings us to the end of our programming for Bold. It really went by in a blur. Thank you to all our speakers, volunteers, We Don't Have Time, and all of you for tuning in and being agents of change. Head over to our website to check out the hot takes, startup pitches, and resources that our speakers want to share with you on their individual speaker profiles. Subscribe to our newsletter to learn about upcoming events. And for those identifying as women, join our free Slack channel, No Climate Experience Necessary. Happy International Women's Day, everyone, and we will see you soon.